thanks very much for coming along. So thanks everyone for joining us today. We've got quite a good room happening here. We've got quite a few people joining us from across the centre and our 4 nodes. So in August this year, we sent out a survey to postdocs to get a better understanding about what kind of training activities in the grant writing space that people were interested in. And from that, we've developed a series of workshops to help plug some of the gaps. And in this workshop series about grant writing, we're not interested in repeating what the research officers of the various nodes of the centre are doing. We try to be a little bit different and plug some of those holes that we've noticed appearing. So last week we had Chuck Fox, who's the Executive Director of Oceans 5, come and talk to us about private philanthropy and marine conservation. But by an incredibly wide margin, the top preference of our postdocs for training was in actually the development of project descriptions or research proposals. And in the ARC world, that means part C or D, depending upon whether it's a fellowship, a linkage or a discovery grant. But we're also talking at this workshop today about the research proposal section of other grants. So for example, the research proposal section in Advanced Queensland Fellowships are about 1,000 words. Or if you think back to the Marine Parks Round 2 grants that were recently put out, it's the section which is about describing your research project and key activities. And in the coming months, a lot of us are going to be putting in ARC grants, but we're also going to be looking at other funding schemes like the revamped YES program too. And so the goal of this workshop today is to really help us understand how we can improve our research proposals and project descriptions. And we're so lucky here at the centre because we have so much in-house talent, right? We don't need to look outside to find some really talented people who've got a lot of experience in this space. And so on today's panel, we have 5 of our researchers here at the centre who are going to be talking about project descriptions, and they represent our 3 programs. So we've got a lot of sort of transdisciplinary insights that we are going to have today. And the way that we're going to run this afternoon is that each of our 5 panellists will have a few minutes to talk about some of the key things that they think you need to consider when developing project descriptions or research proposals. And then we're going to have a Q&A, which I'll moderate. But during the short sort of spills that these guys are going to be giving you, please feel free to write down any questions that you have in the comments box or just write them down on a piece of paper. And at the end of this first 20 or so minutes, after that, I'll be opening up and you can turn off your mics and ask questions that way. Otherwise, I can relay them through the comments section to our panellists. So I hope that all makes sense to you all. And we plan to wrap this up a few minutes before 1 o'clock, so some of us can go to the toilet before our 1 p.m. Zoom meetings, which I'm sure some of you have after this. So to get started, we're going to have Dr. Michelle Barnes, who's a DECRA Fellow and a Senior Research Fellow here at the Centre of Excellence for Coral Reef Studies in Townsville. So I'll just stop sharing.
Great, thanks, Alana. And welcome, everyone. Thanks for taking time out of your day for this. It's definitely an important topic. I'm happy to have been asked to contribute. So my experience is more on grants that have been written for fellowships. So I've received a couple of fellowships, one that's similar to a DECRA that was from the US, and I also have a DECRA here from the ARC currently. Although I have also been involved in other grant proposals as well. But I think what I'm going to be talking about personally is probably going to be a little bit more relevant specifically to ARC and particularly to fellowships. So I have a few points that I think are really critical. So these are just kind of what I think are really important in writing project descriptions. So the first that I think is probably critical for any project, so this is not just fellowships, is get the architecture right. So what I mean by that is, what exactly are you going to be doing and how does it all fit together, right? And so I think one mistake that people make often early in their career is they try to sit down and start writing right away. And I think that's a mistake. I think you need to whiteboard it, diagram it, flow it out before you start writing anything, so that you understand exactly how everything fits together that you're planning to do. And you can have a really clear vision for it before you start writing. This leads directly into my next point, which is about really flowing it out in a diagram or a figure or a box. I think in research proposals that are really successful, they always, at least in my opinion, they have something that reviewers can look at really quickly that helps them get a broad picture or overview of the project. And I have actually a few examples. I think, Alana, you said it's okay to share your screen. Would that be possible to do? So I'll just show you here some examples of what I mean. Can you see that? Great. So this is from my NSF grant that I had that was similar to a DECRA. And this was on, the figure you see on the left was on the very first page. And what it does is show kind of the broad, like, I guess, area of what I was trying to focus on in that proposal. And I highlighted in red the arrows that my research was very specifically going to be focusing on in the proposal. So it just kind of gave people a broad like introduction to like what I'm talking about. And then I focused in on those red arrows. And in the figure caption at the bottom, I even wrote this, you know, the focus of this proposed research is to gain a better understanding of the linkages that are highlighted in red and how they influence outcomes. So it just right there, first page, really clear. And then to the right, you see there's a box that has the research plan and specific tasks. This was also in that grant proposal, and it very clearly laid out exactly what I was going to be doing and how one thing led to the next with the little points there. So I'll leave you with that. I think I just want to show you one more example. And this is actually from one of Josh's previous fellowships. It's from his future fellowship, which he just finished. And so this is something similar. He has identified every objective of his entire future fellowship and written down the exact things that he was going to do under each objective. And this was one of his figures in that proposal as well. So this is what I mean by kind of flow it out, have some sort of diagram or box or figure that reviewers can quickly reference when they're trying to figure out exactly what you're trying to do. Okay, so I'm going to stop screen sharing now. The next thing that I want to point out that I think is really, really important is that you need to write your grant for the audience, right? So your project description, and this is really, really critical when it comes to ARC because you have two audiences that you're really writing for, right? So the first is specialist reviewers, right? So there's people that are very specialized within your field that are likely going to be reading your grant and your project description. So you definitely need to cater to that, but you also need to understand that the decision about whether or not that grant's going to be funded lies with the panel ultimately, and the panel does not actually have, most likely does not have an expert in your field, right? They're going to be highly trained scientists, but they're not going to know the details of your specific field. So you need to tell them why they should care about what you're doing and make it very clear, and don't get lost in the weeds in your project description so much to the point that they can't really understand the relevance or the details of what you're trying to do. So this kind of leads kind of next to my next point is really nailing the first page. And in that first page, and this is critical for especially ARC grants, I believe, you need to have the what and the why explained all on the first page, right? So obviously that might seem like a lot to do in the first page, but I feel like it's really critical to provide at least a brief background that really gives people the context of your research and it tells them why they should care about what you're trying to do. And in that first page, you should be identifying the major gaps and what you plan to do about addressing that gap. And in this case, I don't think you need to get into the details. Obviously, you're still on the first page, right? But you need to have some sort of overview sentence that says what you're going to do. So maybe an overarching research question or something on the first page. So they know before they've left the first page, they know what you're going to do and why it's important. And then you can fill in the details throughout the rest of the proposal. One last thing I want to mention that's really critical in the social sciences is really nailing the theory. It's really critical that you have a theoretical foundation to your grant and your project description. And I suggest in a project description, if you're in the social sciences, that you have a section that specifically says theoretical background or something like that, that makes it very clear. This is where the theory is that relates to my project description. So that way, when you do get your specialist reviewers, they know exactly where that is and they can't come up with some sort of comment that your project is kind of lacking theory, which I think a lot of social scientists that are working in the environmental space get pinned for a lot, because they'll try to gloss over it a bit, because oftentimes we're writing for an interdisciplinary audience and not everyone really, kind of grasps that theoretical depth, but your specialist reviewers will, and they're going to want to see it and they want to know where it is. So that's another thing that I definitely recommend for if you're in the social sciences. So that's kind of my main points. I hope that.
Thanks so much, Michelle. That's great. And I just wanted to point out as well, we're having a little bit of trouble with the comments section. It's not turning up. So if you've got any questions, please just hold off until the end, and we might just need you to do that by switching off your mic. So thanks so much, Michelle. I really like that last insight as well into the theoretical background required in social science project descriptions. And now we're going to jump over to Pete Cowman, who's a DECRA Fellow here at the Centre as well in Program 2.
Hi, Anna, thanks for that. It's actually kind of good because this kind of really follows on from Michelle's comments. I'm going to kind of take you through. I actually went and looked through some of my old drafts from the DECRA that I eventually got, but I will outline first that the first time I put in a DECRA, I didn't get it. And so that was quite disheartening the first time I did it in, I think it was 2013. And then I didn't put one in again until 2016. And so I think a really good sort of thing to think about is the time that you put in, especially for a DECRA, since you're going to get 2 shots in your first 5 years after your PhD. So thinking about when's the most strategic time to do it, but and also saying that I don't think I would have been successful in my second DECRA if I hadn't done my first one, if that makes sense. And so I think writing a grant, even smaller grants and kind of working way up the larger ones, it always sort of the process of doing it really sorts of it's like anything, practice makes perfect. And I really think that, and sometimes if you're writing a grant that's unsuccessful, often the text that you've written in that grant will be useful elsewhere as well, I think. And so recycling is often, it's always good to recycle. So I'm going to share my screen as well, if that's okay. And just 1 second, here we go. Okay, can everyone see what I have on the screen? Yeah, great. Okay, so this was my the DECRA that was eventually funded, and so the first draft of my first paragraph on page 1, on the first page, and as Michelle said, the first page is really important, and for DECRA, the first page really has to stand by itself as well, especially if you're having like a reviewer who may have 60 of these on their desk and they're going through them quite quickly. So if the first page really has to stand alone, you really have to grab the attention in the first paragraph. And so this was my first attempt at my first paragraph. So marine biodiversity is concentrated in coral reefs. Yeah, I give a lot of stuff, and I end with specifically phylogenetic trees can highlight how past climate and biogeographic change are reflected in present-day patterns of biodiversity and provinciality. Now, I got some comments back from 2 mentors, and you could maybe guess who they were from their comments. So this is the first one. I don't find this very compelling. The last 3 sentences are methodological. What are the great unanswered questions, and why are they interesting and important? And then from my second mentor, it was, I'm struggling with this paragraph. It doesn't have a clear point. My own view would be that you should focus on the big perennial questions to which your project is relevant. What determines global scale patterns of biodiversity? I would then address how phylogenetic structure and biodiversity should inform thinking about conservation under national benefit. And so these were really two good comments that I got. And again, when I got these comments, I read back through and I'm like, oh yeah, like, you know, it's a very heavy paragraph. And even I know I like phylogenetic trees and not everyone else does, but mentioning phylogenetic trees in my first paragraph probably wasn't a good strategy. And so the final, I'll note as well that I think I finished my first draft, and this is in 2016, and so this was the end of February, and then it wasn't submitted until April, I think. And so I finished the final version of the first paragraph anyway on March 21st. And so if you have a read of it, so coral reef systems are estimated to support over 830 million multicellular, or 830,000 multicellular organisms. And then I actually asked the question, what determines global scale patterns of biodiversity? And I say it's particularly true for coral reefs where diversity gradients persist across distinct regional assemblages. And so I think this paragraph is a lot cleaner, and it's definitely, there's less jargon. I think it's one thing, especially me being a phylogeneticist, I tend to use jargon a lot, and that's a bad idea, especially in the first page. And so if a good thing to do is what I found as well is have someone read it that isn't a scientist, that isn't a researcher, that isn't in your field, and have them tell you what they don't understand or what sounds that, like, if it can't be understood by them, then it's probably not going to grab the attention of a reviewer or a panel expert. So then I'm just going to show you the first paragraph of a linkage that I wrote. And this is, I'll preface this with the fact that I didn't get it. So you may think it's a bad paragraph, but I think it kind of highlights the difference between a DECRA and a linkage, or the different types of things. And one of the things, it's instead of kind of posing a question, it was more about like saying, well, what's missing in terms of, so I'm saying, despite widespread declines in coral cover, an accurate assessment of extinction risk and resulting loss of coral diversity can't be done without a fundamental understanding of genetic diversity these imperiled assemblages represent. And so that's very different from what I wrote for a DECRA. And the linkage is more about kind of identifying a gap in knowledge or building some capacity to answer something. And it's also important that that's relevant to your industry partner as well. Other things, I think, reading some proposals, using like things like highlighting and stuff is really handy, and especially having summary statements. So in the linkage, I use a lot of summary statements and kind of embolden them as well. And those can be very handy for reviewers that are skimming through and looking for those kind of summary statements. Okay, that's kind of all I have to say. I'll stop sharing.
Thank you, Pete. That was very good. And thanks for sharing those very personal reviews of your successful DECRA application.
Thanks.
Our next speaker is Jenny Donaldson, and Jenny Donaldson is one of our most recent FF awardees, but she also has plenty of other experience in other grant schemes as well. She's been there, done that, haven't you, Jenny?
Yes, and I will also back up Pete on the successful FF being 5th time lucky. So if first you don't succeed, try again. And I think I would agree that I learned more from losing than from missing out than I did from getting it right. And I definitely wouldn't have been able to be successful without having a go a couple of times. I'm going to try and say different things just so you guys don't hear the same thing from all of us, but I definitely back up what Michelle and Pete were saying, and I'm not going to share my screen. I agree with Michelle's idea of brainstorming from the start, and just don't worry about writing and getting all the ideas down. And I would probably follow it up with, don't be afraid to throw away really great ideas that don't fit in, that you don't think you can convince the current state of affairs is a really great idea to fund, and try and really keep the bits in that make a really synthetic sell and a synthetic story. So of course, once you get the funding, you can ask another little side question with the fish you've collected or whatever, but I definitely learned along the journey to maybe tell people a little bit more what they want to hear than what I like to do. Also, I think probably for a lot of people, there's a decision of how far to do new things. So how much to do new from where they're at, and how much the projects in the ARC should look really different from what they do now. I think maybe my advice is really stick mostly to your strengths, stick to the bits that you can sell you do well, and then throw in the novelty and the big ideas and the new things on top of that. Don't go totally outside of your comfort zone and something that you can't sell is you written all over it. And I think those who have been to these sort of workshops before, Sean Connolly gave some good advice of, if they can't see you like Jenny throughout the whole thing, then it's a problem and it probably won't get funded. I I agree that we've probably all been given advice to write the ARC grants for the experts and then write them for your grandma. So make sure that anyone who's reading it can still think that that project is really cool and worth funding. And that's where the panel assessment comes in, and not just your experts. I definitely agree that the first page is really important, but I guess I wanted to maybe counter that idea a little bit and say, don't spend so long on the first page that the rest of it just doesn't come together and doesn't sell, that you can actually do what you've sold on the first page. So I recently read one that I reviewed, and the problem is that the first page was great and the pitch was great and I thought the topic was really interesting, but when I got into the project details, they weren't actually doing what they had sold they would do on the first page. And so as much as I love that idea, I can't really give it really high marks because I didn't think they could achieve it with the methods or the plan that they outlined. I think in terms of comparing ARC funding to non-ARC funding, I think maybe if you have a crazy idea that's a little bit outside of the comfort zone, or maybe isn't something that you think is quite ready to be either a fellowship or a discovery or a linkage, look for those alternative sources to get you going so that you can then have some pilot data that you put into the ARC related funding. Whether it's published or not, you can showcase that it's possible. So I think that smaller grants and other places besides the ARC are probably more willing to take a gamble on a non-ground truth idea or something that isn't quite perfect or fully formulated yet. And I've had more success with that. We're using other funding to be a stepping stone for ARC funding. I guess when you're looking at those grants, they often want to feel like there's good value. So just make sure that when you target the ARC, it's a little bit of a different pitch than a lot of these other sources, and to, if you can, get access to successful grants in any of them. And then my final advice is none of us really start as early as we plan to, but the advice is always get ready early, get ready early, get ready early. And honestly, it does give you more time to get feedback, like Pete pointed out, and to be able to get other people's opinions and develop it better. And I am not the person who does this. I'm just obviously giving the advice. But I do think that if you can get organized a little bit earlier, it does make a big difference. And then I definitely think if you can find a mentor who's willing to sort of like help you through the process and is a little bit more outside of the proposal. So maybe not someone who's embedded in the research you're doing. If you can get that, you'll get a lot of really great advice along the journey as to whether what you're putting out there is actually able to be received in the way you're meaning it, and whether you're getting all your points across, because all of these grants, but especially the ARC, is so short that every word and every sentence has to count. So, you know, it's the number of iterations that you would do for sending a high profile paper off versus one that you have all the space in the world that's in, say, a lower impact journal. So, you know, you have to really, I guess, take on board the criticisms now or ahead of time before you submit it, and you'll have a lot greater chance of success, I reckon. And that's it.
Thank you so much, Jenny. That was some great insight there and some great personal experiences too. And our next speaker is Professor Ryan Lowe, who has the golden touch when it comes to these ARC grants and non-ARC grants too. We've got so much we can learn from you, Ryan. So please spill your beans.
Thanks a lot, for organizing this. Okay, everybody. I'll what I might do. I just was putting down some points that I wanted to make. Oh, can you allow sharing or? No. So, can anybody hear me?
Alana, you're on mute. I can hear you.
Oh, sorry, I'm on mute.
Okay.
You should be able to share your screen. Otherwise, I think you
Yeah,
may
I
have
can share
logged
now. Yeah.
Okay, great. That was my fault. I think you may have logged in as a participant rather than a host, but
okay.
Oh no, it's all looking good now, Ryan. We can see it.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, we got it.
Yeah, I just wanted to run through these more just so I make sure I cover these. But you know, I think the first point, and this has been raised in all of them, is really, you know, think about the scheme that you're applying for, and I think you really shape your proposals based on these themes. I think, having experience writing fellowship applications and discoveries and linkages, like how you frame these are going to be often very different. So with fellowships, it's really all about the person. But my sense with, fellowship applications is it's not just about the details of a project or what you're going to do over this period. It's really, the point of these fellowship schemes is really about how it's going to put you on a path for a research career. So I think, thinking about where you want to end up at the end and sort of building a proposal around that. The other sort of word of advice is it's important to be visionary, but also feasible. And I don't know if fellowship schemes are the right place to, do high risk research and try getting into new areas. I think, you're going to be evaluated mostly on, on the rankings and so on are mostly about the person. You want to build around what you have a track record on and what nobody can really poke holes and say you're going into a whole new area. This is risky. Discoveries, obviously we have, most people have quite a bit of experience with discoveries where it's really about advancing the field. Fundamental science is important, but also increasingly benefits, national benefits and so on, which is increasingly factored in. So linkage is that, particularly in like the coral reef field, is an interesting one because you don't want a linkage proposal to just be finding a partner that's willing to fund your fundamental science research. So that's, I think, quite common where we try finding linkage partners, maybe even a research focused, government agency or something that just wants to let us go do our blue sky research. I think it's really important. What often falls over is what the benefits to the partner are and why they're actually funding this. And I think really put this up front. So it's not just the linkage partner providing cash for, a discovery project. These points have been made. I think the first page is obviously critical. I think this is the one thing where you might just want to print out your first page and walk around your building and ask for feedback, even from people, family members, everything, just to make sure all this stuff is really clear and catches people's attention and makes people want to learn more. Aims is, so that's been emphasized, where you really want to have clear aims and not just have the clear aims, but really use that to then anchor and build your proposal around it. It's, when you're reviewing a lot of proposals, it's difficult when you see like your aims listed out and then, the methods are just some scattered description of all, what you're doing. So it's from my perspective, it's really useful to have your aims and then specifically how somebody can go back in the proposal and look at the methods you're going to use to address those. And obviously visuals are really critical, even on the first page. Nobody wants to see a whole dense page of text, and they want to, I think it's helpful to have some visuals. See this as an issue quite often is the difference between significance and benefit. And it's often, significance from my perspective is really about how you're going to be advancing your field and advancing, your discipline and your research area, and then benefits more about, the benefit to broader society. And I see a lot of cases where in significant sections, people are spending a lot of time talking about what are really national benefits and wasting a lot of, space and so on. And also just factoring that your emphasis, like for linkages, this benefit and is quite critical. For the benefit itself, I think you just want to emphasize the urgency is being conveyed. And I mean, one of my postdoc supervisors told me that when somebody reads a proposal, you actually want them to feel really bad, like they're doing a disservice to humanity if they don't fund this. So I don't know if there's any truth to that, but I mean, it is a good thing that you want to emphasize the lost opportunity if this isn't funded. So I think that's an important point. Michelle made this point earlier, which I think is really critical, is visuals are, I think, almost as equally important as text. I think that's going to get your readers to want to actually read the proposal and college members are, like tens to maybe, it used to be about 100 proposals they're looking at. So they're just going to want to quickly find information. Diagrams, Michelle also made that point that for complex proposals, it's also having flowcharts and diagrams are ways to emphasize how different parts and different aims fit together to have a bigger outcome. So I think that's a common criticism that people get is if you have a proposal that's essentially 3 or 4 sub-proposals, you want to have how this all pulls together into a synthesis. This is, I think, increasingly important is when we write proposals, we often know, you have to know what feedback you're going to get ahead of time. If you go to a conference and you give a presentation and there's groups that don't agree with methods and don't agree with your approaches, or there's different parts of communities and different camps. I mean, actually, when you're writing the proposal, actually think about that. Think about in several months later when you get your rejoinders back, how are you going to address those comments? What are you going to refer to in your proposal that are going to help be rebuttals? So I think that's quite useful because I think there are unfortunately people in the community that don't agree with your methods or don't agree. So have prepare for that. This one, I'm probably more for others as well, is it seems increasingly common, particularly with multidisciplinary proposals where you have non-experts, maybe in all the methods, really focusing and really sinking proposals by saying like, there's not enough details, where in like a fellowship application, there's no way you can, write out every single method, all the detail, all the methods and so on. So I think just factor that in. That kind of goes back to this rejoinders, maybe focus on leveraging what you've done, what you can reference, back to that you've already done where you've proven methods and so on. I think this is the last one or maybe one more. The other one that's really important, I think, is how you choose for codes. So when people assign, when the college is assigning your assessors, they're going to take the initial approach where you have your 4 codes. Assessors all have their own 4 codes listed on RMS, and they're going to get a pool based on those 4 codes. So I think, for example, if you're doing a proposal that has different, pretty like a multidisciplinary proposal where parts of the community are going to be supportive and others may not be. I mean, it's an opportunity to actually steer your proposal into a reviewer pool that may be in your favor. And this is a controversial one maybe, but ARC always talks about innovation and interdisciplinary research and so on. But from my perspective and experience, the strongest proposals and the most successful proposals I've had tend to be in areas that are, you're working in, you're just advancing your area, you're not going into new areas completely. I know that's not what ARC says, particularly like multidisciplinary proposals. I've seen, like with 4 codes, if you choose 4 codes that are like interdisciplinary 4 codes, there's a lot of evidence that those proposals can struggle. So I don't know, that's a tricky one. It'd be interesting to hear what others think about that, but I feel like the strongest proposals are one where you can build off your record and advance your record. All right, that's all I have. Thanks.
That's fantastic. Thanks so much, Ryan. I'm sure we'll have some very interesting discussions about multidisciplinary proposals. I share some of your concerns about whether or not they're able to get up under our current incentive-based programs in ARC. And so our last speaker, before we head into the Q&A, remember just to write down your questions on a piece of paper. We'll have to be using our mics to do the Q&A at the end, as we've lost the comments function down below. Our last speaker is Professor Phil Munday. He's a Chief Investigator here at the ARC Centre and has lots of experience in ARC fellowships as well as discovery projects, and also in non-ARC grants as well. So thank you very much, Phil.
Thanks, Alana. I guess I'm going to reiterate just briefly some of the points that everyone else has made, just really terrific points and great insight already, and just reiterate a few of those and a few other things that I think are really important, or emphasise a few things that I think are really important. Starting with Michelle's opening comment, which I think was super important. Plan months ahead. Don't just think you're going to sit down and write this and it's going to be a great proposal. It's not. you have to really think about it ahead of time, how it all fits together, that this is a whole coherent piece of work. And what I would suggest is you sort of sketch it out, just a skeleton of what it's going to look like and how each piece fits together, and that it is within the sort of scope of what you're expected to do. And that really helps. I mean, often I'd been thinking a year ahead about how a proposal might look. And it's surprising how things just come to you as you're going along about, oh, wow, actually, if I add that, it's going to look much better. And if I drop that. So sort of things that Jenny said is, no, don't be scared to drop something out that might be a great idea, but just doesn't really fit cleanly with what you're trying to put together as one coherent piece. Then in terms of the actual proposal, everyone said this, but it is important. The first 2 paragraphs are critical. Look, if you haven't hooked the reader by the end of the second paragraph, it's pretty much all over, because people are reading, some people, and particularly the College of Experts, are reading lots of these things. And if they're bored by the end of the second paragraph or don't think it's significant, you're going to struggle to get them back. So that's really great. And as I think a couple of people said, and Ryan was saying, visuals are really important. Making sure you've got your aims and objectives, hopefully on the first page in a way that's easy for people to digest. And the visuals aid understanding, and they also break up the text. So they are really important things. But those first 2 couple of paragraphs are important. Everyone has said, remember your audience. And that's just key to it. Remember that if you're doing ARCs, there's the College of Experts, they're absolutely crucial. And then there are experts, but they may not always be real experts in your area. They're going to be other scientists and probably really good scientists, but they won't necessarily know the nuts and bolts of your area of study. So don't get stuck in the weeds. It has to be convincing, but you don't need to tell everyone every little detail. Hopefully, if you can refer to your track record in particular as being able to really, you know all this stuff, you've got it, but just don't make it boring and get stuck down in that. For discovery projects, I've got a little bit of a mantra. Sort of in real estate, the mantra is location, location, location. I'd say for discoveries, the mantra is significance, significance, significance. Know why your study is significant and be able to articulate it. Broad motherhood statements about advancing knowledge or helping manage climate change, look, they won't cut it. These are expert reviewers. They're going to see straight through this. You have to be able to really specify why your study's important and significant in your field. What's the really important question it's addressing? Why is this critical? Is it a long unsolved question? Is it a key knowledge gap that's been addressed or been identified recently? Is there a major economic value? And if you can provide evidence, so try and point back to some reviews or reports or workshops, just to sort of back up this feeling that, wow, this is one of the most significant and important things you could possibly do. Honestly, I've seen so many good proposals that address interesting questions, and then they're just terribly let down by not being able to say why they're important and significant. Why the granting agency should give you the money to do it. It might be good science, but why should they actually give you that money to do it? I'd probably lean a little bit more to the ambitious side of things in terms of the proposal, but within reason. And I think the way Ryan proposed it as visionary but feasible. You really have to demonstrate that it's not just complete pie in the sky. But there is nothing more boring than a boring research proposal. So no, it really does need to have a little bit of ambition. And the one other thing that no one's mentioned so far that I'll just briefly talk about it is the team. And the team is important. Now, let's face it, a big name or two on a proposal gives a lot of extra credibility, and there's a track record that comes along with it in terms of being able to deliver outcomes. But it must be clear what they're going to do. It's pointless having a big name on there if it just looks like, they're your best mate that's agreed to go on it. You have to be able to weave that in. In fellowships, you might actually just have these people as contributors rather than actually PIs or whatever on the grant. But it certainly does help. And having those names really does help the panel and the reviewers see that this is probably achievable and worthwhile. Obviously, the team that you put together is going to really much depend on who you need on your proposal, will depend on your stage of your career. But do think about that. It's not it may not be a big percentage in the actual scores, but it does matter in terms of the sort of perception of the work. I think everyone's sort of pretty well summed up all the other things I would have said, so I'll leave it there.
That's great. Thank you very much, Phil. I really liked the insight you've given about the team, the importance of getting the team right, but also having the team reflected in the proposal as to what they're going to do, and not just bolt-ons at the end because if they're broke. I think that's really great insight. And I ask now that if anyone's got any questions, to either stick your hand up and I'll call you out, or just simply unmute yourself and turn your camera on. We're doing a bit of the Brady Bunch moment here, so we can see everybody's little box, and so please just turn on your mic and turn on your camera if you have a question for our panellists. But whilst all of your confidence grows and you get your questions ready, I've got a question for our panel, and feel free for anyone to respond to this. It's about, I think a lot of us are tempted to repurpose failed proposals for other schemes. Can anyone provide some advice around how to appropriately repurpose, or whether repurposing a proposal for, say, an ARC to a non-ARC, or between a fellowship and a discovery is appropriate or not appropriate? Or, if you can give us some tips on how to do that effectively.
I've got one tip anyway. Going from trying to rewrite a DECRA, so it's not the exact same, but be very aware of the guidelines and the guidelines for the grant and how it's written, and even like headings and sections and stuff like that. Because I got really lost when I was rewriting my DECRA for the second round, that I was still stuck in the mindset of the first DECRA that I'd written and trying to adapt that. In the end, I ended up really chucking out a lot of it and starting from scratch quite a bit. So it can obviously it can be good to try, and if it's a good idea, it's really, and you can write it really well, then it's good to reuse it. But be aware that you can get kind of stuck in a loop sort of thing, or really sort of pigeonhole yourself in that particular grant scheme if you're not aware of what the guidelines are, how different the guidelines are. So that's just from experience anyway. I don't really answer the question. Yeah.
It does. And Ryan, your mic's off. Do you have any? Do you do that? Is something that's
that's. I mean, I think one of the almost sad parts of getting reviews is, there is a lot of randomness and there is some degree of luck. I know we had one discovery that submitted, got only two assessors. Usually you get 4 or 5. Clearly, some negative comments from one that I think really sunk the proposal. But then we looked at those comments and said, well, this person doesn't actually have the right knowledge of this area. And so in that case, we resubmitted and got 4, did some fine tuning, and then, got 4 really good reviews. So I think just digest the reviews you get. And if you feel like there's a lot of truth to the reviews, then maybe don't resubmit. But if you think it's a bit flawed how the assessments were handled, then maybe consider.
Yeah. And you talked about, Ryan, that the different objectives of the different ARC programs, and the same thing happens with sort of non-ARC grants and environment grants as well. Have you seen anyone successfully take a unsuccessful fellowship application and put it into a discovery or a linkage or an environment grant scheme, or vice versa? Is that very rare?
Not turning it into different schemes, but I mean, I think it's very common for, like Peter was saying, it's very common to not get your first fellowship application and build track record and refine it. But yeah, so not crossing schemes.
Mm-hmm.
I have some related experience, sort of going the other way. I had my first fellowship that I did get funded. I originally wrote as a grant for more of like a practice based kind of institution. And then I had to, so then I decided to put it forward for this NSF fellowship, which is similar again to the ARC DECRA fellowship. And that required major work in really beefing up the theory section and adding in like I guess the scientific innovation and aspects of the proposal. So I guess it's possible. I did get funded my first submission for that fellowship, but I did not get it funded through the more like practice-based grant that I was trying to do originally. So anyway, in that case, I guess the advice would be if you are going from something that's more of like a external grant to more of an ARC fellowship or a fellowship application in general, you're definitely going to have to adjust kind of the theory and the emphasis on the science. But also, of course, there's the whole section of the fellowships that have to focus on you, the candidate, as well. So there's a lot of work in that respect, but it's possible.
Yeah. Okay, so sorry, Jenny.
Yeah, I was just going to say that I was always given the advice not to recycle it between the schemes of the ARC. If it was supposed to be a fellowship, it would be mostly playing to your strengths, but if it was a discovery, it would be clearly a collaboration. But I would say that I recycled my first unsuccessful application to the ARC, which was a DECRA, into other Australian fellowship schemes. So that's how I got that fellowship at the University of Technology, Sydney. So maybe it's not about recycling across things that don't fit, but when you put all that effort into a DECRA application, of course, first year out after your PhD, the odds are pretty low. Look around and see what other general fellowship intakes there are, and maybe you have an opportunity for all that work to have a go at something else.
I don't know how familiar others here are, but a lot of universities, what Jenny is just talking about, a lot of universities across Australia have ECR or postdoctoral fellowships. They're generally for the people first 3 years out of their PhD, and they're effectively their schemes to bring in really good talent. The application forms are very similar to ARC DECRA's, the rope's very similar, and they're to get really good talent into universities and then prep them up and so that they're competitive for DECRA applications. And so, yeah, that's a really good point, Jenny. You can recycle sideways when the schemes are kind of, the intent is matched. So does any of our audience have questions for our panellists? Just turn off your mic if you do. If you are unable to turn off your mic for any reason, just give me a thumbs up or something and I will try and endeavour to do that for you. So does anyone have any questions?
Hi, Alana, it's Carrie here.
Hi, Carrie.
Hi, and hello to the panel. Thank you very much for all your insight into fellowships. I'm not quite at ARC stage, but just starting off to write other types of fellowships. I guess one of the things I struggled with at the beginning was visuals. And it's been told to me how important it is, and by all of you on the panel as well. I guess for the fellowships I'd started to apply for, I didn't have sufficient time to really do that diagram planning stage that probably would have assisted me, but I wondered if maybe you could all expand a bit more on the visuals you think are best. I know Michelle showed a few, or platforms that are really good to use as well to produce visuals.
Might have a bit of a go, just because I'm not someone that maybe well known for producing glossy sort of figures. Or, I come from the dinosaur age, and I'm not really up with a lot of the most recent technology and illustrations. So they don't have to be fancy, is what I guess I'm saying. Is that provided you can capture the core essence of something that you're trying to say. And that's it. It has to, don't make it busy. Don't make it too complicated. People don't want to spend 20 minutes trying to understand what your visual actually says. It needs to jump out and tell the person that's looking at this proposal what it is. And just to give you an idea, in my future fellowship that I got in 13, I had, I think, 4 different main themes that I was weaving together. One of them was about environmental variability in CO2. And I just had a figure that had a flat treatment and then a wavy treatment. And it had different colours for different treatment levels. And so it was really, really simple, but it just broke up the page and it immediately gave the reader an into what that whole experiment was all about. Maybe that was too simple, but it doesn't need to be overly complicated. And what I really liked with Michelle's visual that she showed was, for example, having the red lines that she could point towards what were the key things in that, now, which was a little bit of a complicated visual, but it was easy to digest it because it was like, well, just look at the red lines. They're the ones that I'm going to really focus on.
Thanks, Phil.
Thanks. And I've just received through the email 2 questions from Brock. And one of them was about visuals, which I think you've just covered really well there. It was around sort of any visuals that have really grabbed your attention as an assessor. And then Brock's got a follow-up question to Ryan about FOR codes, which are actually really important. I've stuffed that up in the grant once, put in the wrong FOR codes. Never put down engineering or mathematics FOR codes if you're a biological scientist. That's lesson learned, right? And so, Ryan, how do you navigate if you aren't very familiar with who's on the College of Experts, or as an early career researcher? Do you have some sort of a little bit more that you can say about choosing the right FOR codes?
I think you say, I would say the other way around. I wouldn't steer away from a biological work code.
As you're a physical scientist, right?
Yeah, so like recent proposals where, it is kind of a multidisciplinary proposal, but we know that, the strength in your track record is really in this community, and maybe it's a small community. Really think carefully about, what disciplines they're going to associate with. I think, I don't know about the College of Experts. I don't know, it seems to have evolved, but I'm not sure you can necessarily steer stuff to particular college members but it is definitely worth looking at who's on the college and making sure you're, including their perspectives and their research area, not necessarily criticizing an area that, somebody who's on the college might. So I think it's worth just looking at who might be evaluating.
Mm-hmm. And coming to that idea around criticism or critique, is it better just to have a much more positive bent in your application about furthering the science rather than doing, rather than pulling out particular pieces of work or fields which you consider to be deficient? Should we be more positive?
Yeah, aspects? But I guess I'm thinking, like, if you do, some of the work we do, which is linking oceanography and ocean modeling, there's different groups who, are more about statistics, observations, and so I think, I don't know, I think just making sure you're aware of differences in the community, and you probably just being at conferences and presenting, you kind of get that feedback. But yeah, I agree. Never criticize any areas.
I just had a follow-up about the FOR codes as well too, and review and potential assessors that you might be getting. And I think probably people may know this, but they may not. In terms of ARC, you can actually look at everything that's been funded that is under specific FOR codes, right? FRO codes, right? So you can, in that way, sort of look at what type of FRO code might be relevant to your work. If you're doing something that's interdisciplinary, you're not quite sure, you can look, okay, well, what's been funded? Does that sound similar to the kind of research that I'd be doing? Then if I choose that FOR code as my primary, is it likely to go to people that might like it? Then, so anyway, that's something that would be worth looking up if you haven't already.
That's a really good point, Michelle. And so Michelle's talking about the ARC grant search, which is a database that the ARC have available online, which allows you to search basically 20 years of successful grants. So highly recommend that you do that before you consider any of these schemes.
Just quickly to add, I guess that's a really good point, because you could, if you search for those ones that have the FOR code that you're going to select, it's pretty certain that that's going to be your pool of domestic assessors. So yeah.
But even maybe deciding exactly which FOR codes seem to be getting funded. So you can look at, who got funded in last year's round and this year's round. And so if you're deciding between multiple FOR codes, maybe you can use that as an indication of what seems to be in favor at the moment.
Mm-hmm.
I think someone did that pretty well I don't know if they tried to get me as a reviewer on their Decker, but it definitely worked, because a phylogenetic focused Decker came to me and I was like, whoa, this is awesome. And I was like, yes, please fund it. And so it does work, if that's any consolation.
Okay, cool. And so does anyone, we have about a couple of minutes left. And so has anyone here in the audience got any questions for our panelists? Okay.
I actually had a follow-up too, sorry, to
Yep.
one of Ryan's comments earlier. The thing about
multidisciplinarity.
I just wanted to mention that I have heard some advice lately that you can use your budget justification to add more details about specifically what you're doing in your ARC grants if you don't have the space in your proposal. And this was specifically suggested by people that like give, you know, advice to people that are doing ARC grants. So anyway, that's something to think about as well.
Yeah, we like what the discovery we got this year, we didn't have the space to actually do a detailed timeline. And so in that case, we've actually put a detailed timeline and listed all the activities. I don't know if that's, but yeah, I don't know if that's, but it seemed to fit really well with the budget justification where you could map out, you know, because the activities link. So I think, yeah.
Sounds good. So we've probably got one more quick question if anyone can turn off their mic. Otherwise, we might wrap this up so everyone can have a quick break before the next Zoomie at 1 o'clock. But that was, thank you, Jeremy. I'm assuming that means that's a clap. Okay, people are clapping. All right, that means we're all done. So thank you so much to our 5 panelists. That was really insightful and I'm sure that if you've got follow-up questions for our panelists, I'm sure they'll be happy to answer them over email or in the corridor or at coffee at Juliet's or whatever. But thank you so much, Pete and Jenny and Phil and Ryan and Michelle. It's also great to see you as well. We all miss your faces in real life. So thank you so much.